Okay, hello. Right, I'm just recording what is hopefully going to be quite a short little presentation that's going to take you through um, question 2d on the English language paper 1, just so you can, hopefully it will help you revise and prepare for the exam. Right, so first of all, let's just remind ourselves what question 2d actually is. It's the question where you are asked to reread two paragraphs from text C, I think it is, and from each paragraph, you are asked to select three examples of words or phrases from each paragraph, and explain basically how the writer uses those words and those phrases to convey meaning, create effect. So, what are the intended effects of the words and phrases that have been chosen by the writer? How do they impact on the reader, and how do they help to create mood or atmosphere or some kind of feeling? Each one of the paragraphs has a separate focus, so you can really approach them almost as two entirely separate entities. So you can see that first paragraph that for this sample question, which was taken from the June 2020 paper, the focus of your analysis should be all about how the writer communicates to the reader what Clay sees and feels as he's climbing this ladder. So that's all you should be writing about. Then in that second bullet point, the focus has changed, and now you should be examining and exploring how the inside of the bookstore is presented to the reader through the language choices made by the writer. There is a word count. Um, I'm not really sure whether you have to adhere to that really strictly or not. My hunch is that you don't really, but if you take into account the fact that you only have a suggested 25 minutes to answer this question, you're probably only going to end up writing around that amount anyway. Oh, it's worth pointing out here, actually, before we move on, that you're only assessed on your reading ability. So this section of the paper, this answer, your spelling and grammatical accuracy doesn't really matter as long as your arguments and your meanings are clear. And I suppose the reason why I'm saying this is you should try and be ambitious, and you should reach for words that you think really demonstrate your understanding precisely. Don't be scared of misspelling them. Is basically what I'm saying. Right. So before you start to get onto what you actually need to do, I suppose it's quite linked. You need to really think about how, where, and why you're being assessed. This first box here that says notes on task is really an instruction to the examiner. It's guidance to the examiner on how they should be approaching the marking of your response. It's quite interesting to have a look at, I think. So the examiners are told that they should be marking your ability to select powerful, unusual words, and for your understanding of the ways in which these words are effective. There's a list of words in the marking criteria that the exam board guess that you're going to use, hope you're going to use. So there's a list of words or phrases the examiner should expect. And it's interesting to note that those are words that carry connotations additional to their general meaning. So you shouldn't just be choosing words that, this isn't basic comprehension. You're not giving definitions of words here. You're choosing words and images and phrases that carry connotations, that have implications and suggestions associated with them. And these words are the ones you should be selecting are unusual and powerful. Down here, it talks about how you've got to focus on images. So you've got to make sure that you're talking about similes or personification or metaphor to some degree. This here is the actual mark scheme itself in terms of the criteria. This is the top band, it's marked at 15. Things to note, it needs to be a wide-ranging discussion of language. And I suppose what that's pointing you in the direction of, what that's suggesting, is that you should be choosing words and phrases that create or generate different effects. You don't want to be choosing 3 words from the same paragraph that all basically do the same thing. I would argue that that isn't really this wide-ranging discussion of language. It's a really focused, precise discussion of it. So try and be careful when you're considering your choices, and make sure that they're giving you a range of things to say about them. There's an explicit emphasis on the writer here. So as always, when you're analysing language, you really should be thinking about the writer first and foremost. Why have they chosen these words? What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to communicate and convey? And it should really be focused around what the writer is doing. And again, just reinforcing that imagery is it's really important that you write about it, and that you can be imaginative and creative in your interpretation of those images, but that you really understand how to unpick them and explain how they work with some kind of precision. Basically, in short, you need to show that you understand how language works. So what does that mean to you as a candidate and as a student? What do you actually need to do? The first thing, I think, it's really self-explanatory really, but the most central, most important thing is you make good choices when it comes to your word and your phrase selection. We know from what we've just looked at that there has to be a range. We know that the words have to have associations and connotations and implications associated with them. We know that they should be images. And I guess when it comes to images, what the exam board are really after are either you being able to identify some example of personification, or an example of a simile, or an example of a metaphor, or an example of something auditory, some kind of auditory imagery, or gustatory, something to do with taste, bitterness and sweetness, something sensory and something perhaps tactile, surfaces and so on. But most importantly, those words need to be powerful, they need to be unusual, they need to be interesting. They're the words that stand out, not just simple words. I've just marked quite a lot of Year 11 mock responses, 2Ds, and a lot of people are choosing a quote about a filthy penguin. And they were basically saying, the use of the word filthy indicates that the penguin is dirty and disgusting. And of course it does, because that's what the word means. And so it's not a very interesting word choice to just pick out the word filthy and explain what it means. You're not really going to get much marks for that. So try and make sure you're choosing the words that stand out, essentially images that have got some kind of connotations. In my opinion, shortest quotations are best. Big, long quotes, if you choose big, long phrases, you often find out that you don't zoom in closely enough on individual words. So your analysis lacks the precision that is required for that top band answer. Something else you really need to take into account is that before you start writing, you should choose your three language pieces of words and phrases from the text. The reason I say that is because the exam board want you to write an overview at the start of your answer. So if you went back to the question, this one here, and let's talk about this first bullet point. So we should be talking about what Clay sees and feels as he climbs the ladder. So in your answer, the first sentence or two should be you providing this overview of the way in which Clay feels. There needs to be some kind of cohesion in your paragraph and in your response. So you really need to choose your language examples first, and then think about how those 3 words or phrases combine to communicate the way that Clay feels, and then you're able to write a valid and relevant overview statement, and that's where you should start with. Like I said before, you really should be talking about the intended effects, so thinking about what the writer wants to achieve, and think about the effects on the reader. Things that are obvious to talk about there are tone, mood, atmosphere, and sort of sense of feelings. It's important that you consider the words in context Don't tackle them in isolation. Like I said, this isn't some kind of comprehension exercise. It's all about understanding how and showing the examiner that you understand how the language works within the paragraph, in the paragraph that you've been asked to focus on. How are those words and those phrases being used in this context? Range of ideas, I've talked about that already. Try to avoid repeating explanations. You're not going to get any extra marks for that. So words that allow you to say different things, where different effects have been achieved, but that all somehow relate to your overview statement. Make sure you move beyond definition. So yeah, feel free to show that you understand what the word literally means, but then you need to move into exploring the layers of meaning and the connotations and the implications. And one other thing that I think is really important is that you address the bullet points separately. So there are 2 bullet points of the question. You can see them here and here. So write 2 different paragraphs would be my advice. There are 2 distinct parts to the task. And so when an examiner looks at your answer, there should be 2 distinct parts to your answer. There should be paragraph 1 that deals with the first bullet point, paragraph 2 that deals with the second bullet point. And within each of those paragraphs, there should be 3 words or phrases quite clearly examined and analysed in turn separately. So there's a 6-step process to how this works in practice. So you're in the exam. What do you need to do? You need to read the question first, obviously, and you need to highlight the focus. You need to make sure that you're choosing words and phrases from the paragraph that are connected in some way to the focus of the task. So, for example, in that first bullet point, what Clay sees and what Clay feels. There's not any other words are totally irrelevant. It needs to be focused on what Clay sees and feels. So highlight the focus so you're really aware of it. Then reread the paragraphs that you've been told to. Check your understanding of what's happening in the paragraph. Make sure you get it. And then start thinking about that overall impression and feeling in relation to the focus of your task. Then move into picking out 3 examples of powerful, interesting language use. Aim for 2 images if you can. Obviously, if you can't, find 2. Make sure you choose at least 1. And then start thinking about what the overall effect of those 3 examples is, because that will help you write your overview statement. Then obviously you move into writing your answer to write your first paragraph, which is addressing bullet point 1. Start with the overview. So many people forget, and I recognise it's easy to forget that, but really try not to. Then move on to your 3 words and phrases, examining each one in turn, and repeat in an entirely separate paragraph for the second bullet point. At the very end, just double check that you've definitely talked about 6 words in total, 3 for each paragraph, and that some of them are images. It's so important. So let's sort of see how that works, I guess. And I've written a model response that I'll sort of take you through now. So let's talk about this first bullet point. So reread paragraphs 1 and 12. Paragraph 1 begins, lost in the shadows, is about what Clay sees and feels as he climbs the ladder. So most of the texts have this little bit here in italics. That is not paragraph 1. Okay, so make sure you recognise make sure that you're definitely answering the correct. You're reading and analysing the correct paragraph. So, and what does Clay see and what does Clay feel? Okay, so I've read the question, I've highlighted the focus. I'm now going to reread the paragraph and see if I can understand what's happening in it. So, lost in the shadows of the shelves, I almost fall off the ladder. I'm exactly halfway up. The floor of the bookstore is far below, the surface of a planet I've left behind. The tops of the shelves loom high above. It's dark up there, books are huddled together, not letting any light through. The air might be thinner too. I think I see a bat. I'm holding on for dear life, one hand on the ladder, the other on a shelf, fingers pressed white. So my understanding of what is going on in that paragraph is that Clay, the first person narrator, is climbing up a ladder in a bookstore. He's gone really high. He feels that he's dark and he feels that it's dark up there and he's miles away from the floor, and there's a sense that it's quite dangerous what he's doing, and maybe that he's a little bit scared. So that's kind of my understanding of what's happening. So the overall impression. So what does Clay see and feel? I'm going to really focus more on the feel, I think. He feels scared. He feels isolated. He feels in some way that he's in danger. And what does he see? He sees obviously the books up there and the darkness up there. Okay, right, so I've got a sense of that. So now I need to highlight my 3 examples and phrases. I've already highlighted that first one, Lost in the Shadows, so I think I'm going to keep that because I just think that's a really effective opening image. And then I want to look through for another image. I almost fall off the ladder. There's nothing really that can be said about that. It's self-explanatory. All I would be doing there is defining and re-explaining what it means. I'm exactly halfway up. Again, I don't really see much interest in there. The floor of the bookstore is far below. So far below could be a potential phrase. I'm not really 100% sure what I'd say about that. But this sense of distance maybe is exaggerated, far below. But I'll move on. The surface of the planet I've left behind, right, that's clearly an image. So I feel like I'm going to talk about that as if the ground is so far away that he feels like he's left Earth and he's somehow up in space. Really hyperbolic, so I'm definitely going to talk about that. The tops of the shelves loom high. I could definitely talk about looming high. He feels intimidated, scared. That's something that he sees and feels. It's dark up there. Books are huddled together. That's a nice bit of personification. Books being huddled together. Does it really tell me about what Clay feels, though? Maybe not. I can't think off the top of my head what I would say. The air might be thinner too. That's quite nice because it links to the surface of the planet I've left behind, almost like he's at altitude and the air's getting thinner, and maybe this idea of altitude sickness. So that could be quite interesting as well to analyse. He thinks he sees about, I'm holding on for dear life. Like that. I quite like that one. It's quite cliched, but it certainly shows how he's feeling. He's feeling scared. He's feeling that the situation is a dangerous one, that his life's in peril, perhaps. That's going to do me. I could talk about the fingers pressing white in much the same way as holding on for dear life, but I think I'm going to go for those 3. I've got 2 clear images and a phrase that's quite cliched. I'm holding on for dear life, but it certainly reveals how he's feeling. So now I need to go about constructing my response. So write my first paragraph in bullet point 1. Start with the overview. Okay, so this is a nice way of starting your overview, and you can, in paragraph 1, the writer dramatically communicates the feelings of isolation and danger that Clay is experiencing. So it's really, really focused on the question. This is how he's feeling. He's feeling isolated and he's feeling in danger. Notice that I'm really talking about the writer and what the writer is doing. The writer is communicating something, and he's communicating how Clay is feeling, and that those feelings are that he's isolated and he's in danger. So I'm signaling to the examiner that I've read the focus, the task, I really understand it, and I'm going to write a really precise response. The opening image of the paragraph, notice how I've flagged up that I'm going to talk about an image. Really signpost that image. The opening image of the paragraph where Clay says he is lost in shadows helps to communicate this effect. So I'm going to talk about this quote here. I've embedded it seamlessly into my sentence. I've identified it as an image. So far the examiner's happy. Now I need to go in to do a bit of analysis. So indeed, the visual image, just to reinforce that I recognize it's an image, seems to suggest. So you can see that suggest is an analytical verb, and if you go through and look at all of the verbs I use, you should see that there's a lot of analytical ones in there. So I'm talking about the effects created by the reader. So this image suggests that Clay cannot be seen up the ladder in the dark. So I'm starting with the literal here. He's lost in the shadows, suggests he can't be seen. So I'm showing the examiner that I understand the literal meaning. But then I go on to say, but that's unlikely to be literally true because he's not that high up really. But it does help to create a sense of drama. Okay, right. Now I'm going to zoom closely into words and talk about their effects. So I'm recycling some of the words from the initial quotation, lost in shadows. Being lost suggests to the reader that Clay is feeling vulnerable and is in some way cut off. Okay, there's my analysis. Whereas the reference to shadows conjures up an almost nightmarish image, maybe a bit over the top, but I'm going to go for it, that reminds the reader of the horror genre. This idea of being lost in the shadows, it's scary, it's terrifying. It certainly goes back to my topic sentence that he feels in danger. So that's the first quote dealt with. I've identified it as an image. I've shown that I understand what it means literally, but also how it works in a more connotative sense. Now I'm going to move on to my second language choice. The writer also suggests a sense of isolation in the image of Clay leaving the surface of the planet behind. Another embedded quote. This image, again signposting it, implies that he is so high, showing that I understand what it means. It means that he's high up, but it implies that he's so high up that he could be in outer space. He's left the surface of the planet. It's clearly hyperbolic. So that's a good technique I've used here, hyperbole. I've zoomed in. I recognise that the writer's using that method. But it's effective. It's just suggesting a sense of otherworldliness and this idea that Clay is feeling detached and distant. So I think that otherworldliness is me, if I just flick back quickly to the mark scheme, I think that's me showing imagination. I'm tackling the image with imagination. I'm saying it creates the idea that being in this bookstore high up among the books in the dark is almost this otherworldly experience, and that he feels detached from reality. So I think I've done a good job of that one. And I'm going to move into my third and final quote, showing the examiner that I'm doing that. Finally, I'm helping guide him through my response, or them through my response. Finally, Clay's claim to be holding on for dear life reinforces the danger he is in. So nicely connected back to my topic sentence. He is gripping onto the ladder tightly. I show that I understand what it literally means, and clearly feels like his health and safety is at risk. And then I sort of go on to say what the general effect is. I show that it's a cliche. That's the technique being used, I guess, the cliche. The cliched phrase helps create dramatic tension. And I'm going to step away from my response. Let's just double check it like it says I should do in stage 6. Step 6. Have I used 3 words? Yes, I have. Have I talked about imagery? Yes, I have. I can move on to my second response. So the things I think are important for you to take away from looking at this model response is 1, I've used an overview. 2, I focus on the writer throughout. You can look through this. I'm talking about what the writer is doing, the intended effect of the writer. 3, I'm using lots of analytical verbs. I'm saying what things suggest, what things imply, how things are created, communicated. I'm embedding my quotes. Short, small quotes embedded seamlessly into my text. I'm signposting to the examiner that I'm using images. I'm focusing on images. And my explanations are extended. So if you have a look at that first one, the opening image of the paragraph where Clay says he is lost in shadows helps to communicate the effect that he's isolated in danger. Indeed, it suggests he can't be seen, unlikely to be true, creates a sense of drama, makes him seem vulnerable, cut off, conjures up a nightmarish image, reminds you either of the horror genre, really extended, but still relatively sort of succinct and concise. And finally, I feel that I'm making precise comments, and it's really tightly focused on the task. If you went back to that first bullet point question, have I really examined what Clay sees and feels? I feel that I have. And so I think that that's a top band response. And it's going to get me an A star for this section, if you know what I mean. It's going to put me in that top band, hopefully getting me close to 15 out of 15, but definitely cementing me in that top band, I think. Okay, right. I will leave it at that.